After a nearly 3-month trial in New York that showed the inner workings of his drug cartel, the kingpin known as El Chapo was found guilty by a jury today. He now faces life in prison. Nick Schifrin has more on today's verdict and whether it will affect the wider ongoing drug trade.
Today's verdict came after years of arrests, dramatic escapes from prison, and international manhunts for El Chapo, whose real name is Joaquin Guzman. Prosecutors said during Guzman's reign, the Sinaloa cartel became the largest and most prolific drug trafficking organization in the world. Throughout the trial, attorneys revealed new details about the financing and history of the cartel, details of murders committed personally by Guzman, and how, for decades, the cartel sent vast amounts of cocaine, heroin, meth, and synthetic drugs into the U.S. And they said El Chapo himself made nearly $14 billion in illicit profits. The jury deliberated for 6 days before delivering its verdicts. Defense lawyers said they, quote, never faced a case with so many cooperating witnesses and so much evidence, but said they plan to appeal. Noah Hurwitz has been covering the trial for Rolling Stone and joins me now. Noah Hurwitz, thanks very much for being on the NewsHour. Can you tell us about the scene in the courtroom today and how El Chapo responded to the verdict?
I mean, we've been waiting now for about a week, or a little over a week, for the verdict to come. And when it finally came, there was a mad dash upstairs. Everybody had to go through this TSA-style security checkpoint just to get into the courtroom. And then once we settled in, Guzman came in. He's been in pretty good spirits in the last week, because every day that the jury deliberated was another day that he didn't have to be in solitary confinement. But when the verdict finally came, he did seem a little bit crestfallen, although he tried to signal hope to his wife, who was sitting in the second row of the gallery. He gave her a little smile, a nod, a thumbs up before being led away.
There were more than 50 witnesses, more than a dozen cartel insiders. From the outside, this seemed like an open and shut case. Why do you think it took the jury more than a week?
The actual charges were pretty complex. So there was just a lot of evidence to go over. There was a sort of complexity to the actual charges. And, we had 3 months of testimony. Like you said, we had 14 cooperating witnesses, each of them talking about a different phase of Guzman's life, a different part of his career, and dozens of law enforcement witnesses. So all of this together just was a lot to go over, and the jury really took their time with it.
Guzman is notorious, but as you just mentioned, we learned a lot about phases of his life and of his career. What was most surprising?
The most shocking part of testimony, I think, just from being there the whole time, was there was a witness named Isaias Valdez Rios who told this just horrific tale of violence. He described how Guzman personally tortured and executed several rival cartel members, and just he brought us right there. He brought the jurors right there. And during that testimony, more so than any time during the whole trial, the jurors, some of them had just these 1,000-yard stares. They were staring at their feet. You could hear a pin drop. And I think that day was the most shocking because throughout it all, we got a sense of Guzman as a person, but never before had we really heard of that level of violence or brutality. And the details in that testimony were just shocking. And it was interesting because the murders were only a small part of the case. He wasn't actually charged with murder, but that was part of the continuing criminal enterprise. But I think that really helped jurors see El Chapo in this new, brutal light that was eluded at times by the more business-like aspects of the cartel operations.
And those cartel operations, again, they are notorious. But what did we learn about how the Sinaloa cartel worked?
Well, these witnesses really brought us inside the Sinaloa cartel. Starting from the beginning, really right up until the end, we learned details about how they trafficked cocaine, how they dealt with rivals, how they made connections with suppliers in Colombia, and really just, the day-to-day operation. We learned about how El Chapo lived his life in the mountains when he was in hiding between 2001 and 2014, And we learned a lot about how he communicated and how he was able to direct the day-to-day operations of the cartel from afar. And a lot of this was stuff that really hadn't been known before. You know, a lot of this was stuff that had to be described by insiders.
And what can we take from this guilty verdict about not only the future of this cartel, but the future of the drug trade from the United States southern border into the United States?
Well, one thing that this tells us is that the U.S. is willing to and able to prosecute drug lords from other countries, however powerful. However, you know, the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel is relatively intact. There's no stop to the drugs flowing across the border. Recently, federal agents made the largest seizure of fentanyl in history on the Arizona border. You know, there's just these individual cartel leaders may be fallible and they may be vulnerable to arrest and extradition to the United States, but it doesn't seem like this, you know, the prosecution and the conviction of El Chapo has really done anything at all to stem the tide of drugs flowing into the U.S.
Noah Hurwitz with Rolling Stone, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.